The village of Leone was unlike any other in the surrounding valleys, shrouded in misty forests and perched on the edges of jagged cliffs. It was a place where silence reigned more than law, where gossip was whispered only behind closed doors, and where certain topics were so feared that even the bravest villagers avoided them. The very air seemed heavy with restraint, carrying a subtle warning: speak too freely and the consequences might follow. Children were taught from a young age to observe before asking, to listen before speaking, and to value quiet as much as survival. Those who disregarded this unspoken code often found themselves isolated, their words dismissed, their reputations quietly tarnished. In Leone, silence was not just a practice, it was a form of control, a way to maintain peace and order, yet it also carried an undercurrent of fear. Among the villagers, Amira stood out as a radiant presence, even in such a somber environment. 17 years old, she carried herself with a natural authority, a soft but compelling aura that drew others to her without effort. Her dark eyes held a spark of curiosity, constantly observing, analyzing, and seeking understanding. Her laughter, rare and precious, could momentarily lift the oppressive hush that seemed to cling to the village streets. Even those wary of strangers felt compelled to notice her, for there was something about Amira that suggested wisdom beyond her years, a quiet understanding of people and situations that was both inspiring and unsettling. Amira's bond with her family was deep and nurturing. Her mother, though long past, had left a legacy of gentle teachings and stories, instilling in her the values of compassion, intelligence, and courage. Her father, a man of measured words and thoughtful presence, admired his daughter's insight, often seeking her perspective on matters that perplexed the elders. Amira spent time with the village elders as well, absorbing their stories, listening to their histories, and quietly contributing observations that revealed her growing understanding of human nature. She was not boastful, but her intelligence and kindness naturally positioned her as a figure others could trust, a beacon of guidance in a community that otherwise operated under strict caution and restraint. Yet her gifts did not go unnoticed in ways that were entirely positive. While many admired Amira, others felt threatened by her innate influence, the subtle power of her presence. Among them was Soraya, a councilwoman with a long history of jealousy and ambition. Soraya prided herself on maintaining order and upholding tradition, yet Amira's natural leadership and insight unsettled her. The young girl's ability to see through pretense, to offer counsel that resonated with both elders and peers, made Soraya's authority feel fragile. The councilwoman began to regard Amira with suspicion, questioning her motives in whispered conversations and casting wary glances whenever Amira spoke in the village gatherings. Tension simmered quietly as the village continued its rigid adherence to silence. While Amira's influence grew organically, the fear of breaking tradition and challenging authority lingered in the air. Villagers who admired her did so discreetly, careful not to draw attention that might provoke Soraya or invite unwanted scrutiny. Even in her daily routines, visiting elders, assisting families, or tending small community tasks, Amira's awareness of the unspoken boundaries guided her actions. She navigated the village with grace and mindfulness, understanding that her gifts, while powerful, also made her vulnerable in a community quick to enforce conformity. Despite the quiet caution surrounding her, Amira remained unwavering in her curiosity and compassion. She sought to learn, to grow, and to use her abilities for the betterment of the people around her. Her presence began to inspire subtle changes, a softer approach to conflicts, small acts of kindness performed quietly, and unspoken encouragements that lifted the spirits of those struggling under the weight of the village's silence. The villagers, while wary, could not ignore the quiet shift she brought. And though Soraya's jealousy lingered like a shadow over Amira's bright spirit, the girl's resilience and insight suggested that her influence would continue to grow, silently shaping the hearts and minds of Leone even under the watchful gaze of those who feared her power. The stage was set for the conflict to come, a collision of light and envy, of courage and control, that would soon ripple through the entire village. Amira's gift was subtle at first, like a soft breeze that shifted leaves without warning. Her voice, delicate yet commanding, held a power that went beyond ordinary speech. When she spoke, people could feel the truth resonating deep within them, their emotions subtly guided by her words. A gentle phrase could calm anger, a careful question could reveal hidden feelings, and encouragement could spark courage even in the most timid heart. She discovered this gift gradually, realizing one day that a simple word of reassurance could ease a dispute between neighbors or inspire a young villager to confront a challenge they had long avoided. It was as though her voice carried a resonance that harmonized with the unspoken needs of those who listened. Amira used this power with quiet discretion. She would walk through the village at dawn, pausing in courtyards where conflict simmered or where someone's sorrow went unnoticed. A whispered word here, a soft suggestion there, and she could see the subtle shifts take place. The tension between quarrelsome neighbors eased, the tears of a grieving mother dried, the courage of a young boy strengthened. None of her interventions were public. She avoided recognition, understanding that her influence could easily be misconstrued as manipulation if exposed. Yet her acts did not go unnoticed entirely. Those she helped began to speak of small miracles, of resolutions that seemed too precise to be coincidence, and quiet admiration for the girl with the extraordinary voice grew, even under the village's enforced silence. Soraya watched all of this with a mixture of fear and envy. She observed the way elders listened when Amira spoke, how her peers gravitated toward her counsel, and how her actions inspired loyalty without a single command. The councilwoman, accustomed to wielding influence and ensuring control over the village's affairs, felt her authority waver. Each act of kindness, each carefully spoken word by Amira, seemed to chip away at the invisible walls Soraya had built to maintain her dominance. Rumors that had once sufficed to cement her status now failed to intimidate. Instead, whispers of Amira's wisdom began to circulate in hushed tones, subtly challenging the old hierarchies. Soraya's fear transformed into determination. If Amira's voice could inspire courage and unity, she would need to be silenced before her influence became unstoppable. Amira's father, a man of deep love but measured caution, sensed the growing tension. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the misty cliffs and shadows crept across their home, he spoke to her quietly. "Amira," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "your gift is extraordinary, but you must understand that power always invites envy. Some may not wish you well, and even those closest to you can be swayed by fear or suspicion. Use your voice wisely." Amira nodded, absorbing the advice, but her resolve remained unshaken. She knew that the good her words could accomplish outweighed the risk of envy. "Father," she replied softly, "I will continue to help those who need me. Fear cannot silence truth and kindness cannot be hidden forever." Her conviction, calm yet unwavering, demonstrated the depth of her courage, and her father, though apprehensive, could not argue against the righteousness of her intentions. But as her voice inspired hope and courage among the villagers, it also drew the eyes of those who saw her influence as a threat. Soraya quietly convened a meeting with a small group of envious elders, those who feared change or the empowerment of ordinary villagers. They spoke in hushed tones, fearful of being overheard, and devised a plan to contain the girl who had so quietly captured the hearts and loyalty of the people. The conspiracy was subtle yet insidious. Whispers of suspicion, fabricated tales, and manipulations designed to isolate Amira from her friends and allies. They worked to plant doubt in the minds of her supporters, spreading carefully measured rumors about her intentions, suggesting that her guidance might conceal personal ambition rather than altruism. The elders did not stop at social manipulation. They approached Amira's father, sowing seeds of doubt and subtly challenging his trust in her. "She seeks influence," they suggested, "and power unchecked is dangerous. Are you certain her guidance is entirely for the village and not for herself?" Her father, torn between faith in his daughter and the pressure of his peers, began to question, though the trust he had built over years made him reluctant to confront the truth fully. The council then convened a secret meeting hidden from the eyes of the villagers, where they reached a chilling decision. Amira's presence must be erased entirely. Her name would no longer be spoken, her actions dismissed, and if necessary she would be banished. The conspiracy was thorough, designed to extinguish her influence quietly without causing open uproar, for the elders knew that confrontation could provoke rebellion if her supporters resisted. Amira, perceptive and sensitive to the currents of emotion around her, began to sense the betrayal even before it was openly enacted. She noticed subtle shifts, friends avoiding her gaze, elders whispering behind closed doors, and an unspoken tension thickening the air in the village. The realization stung, but she struggled to confront it openly. Speaking against a conspiracy so carefully orchestrated could endanger not only herself but also the villagers she sought to protect. Yet, in the quiet recesses of her mind, a plan began to form, a way to endure, to survive, and to ensure that her voice, though threatened, would continue to resonate beyond the walls of fear and envy. Even in the shadows of treachery, Amira's courage and clarity remained. She understood that true power was not given by titles or recognition but by the ability to inspire change, even when silence seemed imposed. The stakes were higher than ever, yet her heart remained steadfast, ready to meet the challenge that lay ahead with the same resolve that had guided her through every whispered secret of the village. The night was unusually dark, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds, casting the village of Luanga into a shadowy stillness that seemed almost unnatural. The usual quiet of the streets was replaced by an oppressive silence, thick with anticipation and dread. From the shadows, a group of masked villagers moved with careful precision, their faces concealed not only to protect their identities but to add to the weight of secrecy surrounding their task. They carried lanterns that flickered weakly, illuminating the narrow paths as they approached Amira's home, where she lay resting, unaware of the impending betrayal. The moment was swift and silent. Before Amira could fully awaken, the masked figures surrounded her, their hands firm but not cruel, guiding her from her bed and into the waiting shadows outside. She tried to speak, her voice trembling with fear and confusion, but one of the masked elders placed a gloved hand gently over her mouth, a warning rather than a threat. "Silence is for your protection," a whisper came, though the words did little to soothe the tremor in her heart. They moved through the village like shadows of the night itself, avoiding the homes of those who might witness their actions. Every step was deliberate, every movement rehearsed, a silent testament to the meticulousness of the conspiracy against her. When they reached the outskirts of the village, near the edge of the forest and the mist-covered cliffs, they paused. Here the symbolic burial of Amira's identity would take place. Her name, already struck from the village records, would now be erased from the collective consciousness, enforced by fear and secrecy. Her personal belongings, gifts from friends, keepsakes from her mother and small tokens of her life, were collected and removed, leaving her with only the simple cloak she wore, a solitary reminder of her existence. The elders and enforcers of the conspiracy spoke in hushed tones, swearing oaths of silence and secrecy that bound them with a mixture of fear and loyalty. The act was as much psychological as it was practical. By erasing her presence, they hoped to erase her influence, to extinguish the power of her voice before it could reach beyond the carefully constructed boundaries of the village. Amira was left standing alone, shivering under the weight of the night and the cold wind that swept across the cliffs. Her heart pounded, a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief coursing through her veins. She felt the weight of abandonment keenly, knowing that the very people she had helped, the villagers who had once relied on her guidance, were now bound to silence, forbidden to speak her name or offer assistance. The oppressive quiet was suffocating, yet in that silence, a strange clarity emerged. Alone on the outskirts of the village, Amira could feel her own inner strength beginning to crystallize. Despite the efforts to erase her, Amira refused to let the night consume her spirit. She whispered words softly into the darkness, words of hope, courage, and reassurance, letting them drift into the wind. Even when unseen, the truth cannot be hidden. Even when unheard, goodness remains. Her words, though faint and fragile, carried a power that seemed to resonate beyond the immediate space around her. The wind, as if recognizing her intent, picked up the whispers, carrying them toward the village in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Those villagers who had once received her guidance began to notice changes, small sparks of clarity or courage that arrived without explanation, as though her presence lingered in spirit rather than flesh. Amira's mind was alive with thought and reflection. She considered the injustice of the night, the betrayal of those she had trusted, and the cruelty of the conspiracy. Yet, she did not allow anger to dominate her. Instead, she focused on what she could control, her voice, her thoughts, her actions. She began speaking in careful, deliberate phrases, crafting messages of encouragement and wisdom, knowing that even if her words reached only a few, their effect would ripple outward. "Courage is not the absence of fear," she whispered, letting the wind carry it, "but the choice to rise despite it. Strength is not in domination, but in the quiet persistence of truth." As the night wore on, the shadows around her seemed less menacing. The forest that had once appeared threatening now offered shelter, and the cliffs, though precipitous, provided a vantage point from which she could observe the village without being seen. Amira realized that although her identity had been symbolically buried, her essence could not be erased. Her wisdom, kindness, and courage had already taken root in the hearts of those she had touched, and that seed would continue to grow, unseen but enduring. In the village, a strange tension settled over the streets. People who had once admired Amira in secret found themselves whispering reassurances to one another, performing small acts of courage or kindness that felt guided by an invisible hand. Rumors of her disappearance spread slowly, wrapped in fear, yet her influence persisted in subtle ways. Some spoke of hearing a faint voice in the wind, others noticed inexplicable resolutions to disputes, small miracles that suggested she was not truly gone. The conspirators, confident in their success, failed to recognize that Amira's power was not bound to physical presence or spoken recognition. It was something deeper, enduring, and inescapable. By the time the first light of dawn touched the village, Amira stood alone yet unbroken, a quiet figure of resilience at the edge of the forest. The night of silence had not defeated her, it had sharpened her resolve. Her voice, though constrained, had found new ways to reach those in need, proving that even when buried, her essence, her power, and her influence could not be extinguished. In that lonely vigil, Amira understood a profound truth. True strength lies not in being seen or heard, but in inspiring others to act, even when you yourself must remain in the shadows. And so, beneath the mist and the quiet hush of the village, the first whispers of hope began to echo, carrying the promise of a power that would not be silenced. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the village of Luanga began to stir. The long-held silence that had governed their lives, enforced more by fear than law, started to loosen, not through rebellion, but through quiet courage inspired by the invisible presence of Amira. Those who had once obeyed out of caution now felt the subtle nudges of her whispers in the wind, guiding them to act with bravery and integrity. The words she had spoken in exile, soft, deliberate, and full of conviction, seemed to settle in their hearts, urging them to stand for what was right and care for one another even when the eyes of the powerful were upon them. At first, these acts were small and secretive. A villager would step in to mediate a dispute, offering a fair solution where silence had once allowed resentment to fester. A mother would encourage her daughter to speak up, providing the courage to voice a thought or concern she had long suppressed. Hidden messages left on windowsills, carved subtly into tree bark, or whispered to trusted friends began appearing, each one a spark, a reminder that the presence of Amira could still guide them, even if her physical form had been removed. The villagers, cautious yet inspired, began to act as though an unseen hand directed them, a force of righteousness that encouraged care, compassion, and courage in the face of fear. Soraya, once confident in her ability to control the village, began to notice the shift and felt panic take hold. The subtle defiance, the small but deliberate acts of bravery and kindness, could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Villagers who had previously avoided her gaze now met her eyes with quiet resolve, subtly resisting her manipulations. Discussions that had once been controlled and dictated by fear began to shift, as whispers of fairness and justice passed from one villager to another. Soraya could see the invisible influence of Amira everywhere, and with each passing day her fear grew, for she understood that control over hearts could not be imposed by law or threats alone. Amira, watching from the edges of the village and the surrounding forest, felt a quiet satisfaction as she observed the subtle yet powerful changes. Her words, carried by the wind and internalized by the villagers, had taken root, manifesting in courage that no threat could suppress. She saw young men and women stepping forward to defend the weak, elders quietly correcting injustices, and even former skeptics acting with integrity and compassion. Each act, though small in isolation, collectively formed a wave of quiet revolution, challenging the long-standing culture of fear and silence without confrontation. The transformation reached a key moment during a public gathering, ostensibly routine but significant in the village's life. It was an event attended by all, where traditionally the elders would speak, decisions would be enforced, and silence was maintained as the unspoken rule. This time, however, the villagers collectively chose to honor the teachings that Amira had instilled in them, doing so in a manner that allowed them to avoid direct confrontation while still defying the enforced silence. They arranged symbols, subtle gestures, and careful displays that spoke volumes. Children wearing emblems that represented courage, messages carved into communal spaces, and a chorus of shared whispers that, though quiet, were unmistakably heard by those attuned to meaning. Every action was deliberate, a tribute to the invisible guide who had inspired them. The effect was immediate yet understated. Among the villagers, a renewed sense of agency took root. Fear no longer dominated every decision, replaced instead by a cautious but palpable confidence. They began to speak, sometimes only in whispers, sometimes through small acts that communicated more than words ever could. The culture of silent obedience, which had long suppressed initiative and courage, began to crumble as each person internalized the lessons Amira had left them. Through her absence, her power grew, proving that influence was not tied to visibility but to the depth of impact one could leave on the hearts of others. Soraya, witnessing this subtle yet undeniable shift, realized that her grip on the village had been broken, not by force, but by the enduring resonance of one young girl's courage, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to truth and justice. The villagers' collective acknowledgement of Amira's teachings, though performed in secret, marked a turning point, the silence that had once bound them was giving way to a quiet awakening. From the forest and cliffs where Amira lingered, she felt the wind shift with a sense of triumph. The villagers had begun to embody her words, each whisper, each act of courage a testament to the enduring power of truth, integrity, and invisible guidance. The village, once paralyzed by fear, was awakening, and though Amira remained physically absent, her presence had never been more real. Through the wind, her whispers had become the heartbeat of Luenga, inspiring bravery, justice, and hope that could no longer be silenced. The days following the villagers' quiet awakening marked the beginning of Soraya's unraveling. Her authority, once unquestioned, now faced subtle but relentless challenges at every turn. Acts of courage and justice, inspired by Amira's whispers, became increasingly public. Where once villagers had acted only in secret, the lessons they had internalized began manifesting openly. A market dispute was resolved fairly without her intervention, a wrongly accused laborer was defended, and the village children, guided by the example of those who had been emboldened by Amira, spoke up against petty injustices that Soraya had long allowed to persist. Each act, seemingly small, chipped away at the fear and control that had underpinned her rule. Soraya struggled to maintain composure. She attempted to intimidate the villagers, to remind them of the strictures of tradition and the power she wielded, but her words fell flat. The whispers of Amira, carried by the wind and internalized by those she had touched, had woven themselves into the moral fabric of the community. No threat could override the courage that had begun to pulse quietly in every corner of the village. Even those elders who had once conspired with Soraya hesitated, their loyalty wavering in the face of undeniable change. Where fear had once dictated obedience, admiration for Amira's unseen influence now encouraged integrity, kindness, and decisive action. The council, convened to reassert authority, found themselves in an impossible position. For the first time, they faced collective resistance that could not be ignored or punished without public backlash. Villagers spoke up, citing acts inspired by Amira's teachings, subtly but unmistakably demonstrating that their obedience was no longer absolute. Soraya tried to dismiss these claims, attributing them to coincidence or independent thought, but the evidence of transformation was everywhere. The council had to acknowledge, whether reluctantly or in stunned silence, that the power of one spirit, though unseen, had transcended the boundaries of rules, fear, and enforcement. Meanwhile, Amira remained physically distant, hidden in the forests and cliffs at the edge of the village, yet she felt the effects of her influence with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The wind carried her words further than she had imagined, and the villagers' actions demonstrated the profound reach of her guidance. She observed from afar as the community she had nurtured in secret began to embody the principles she had instilled: courage in the face of injustice, honesty in speech, and integrity in action. The village's moral compass, once warped by fear and manipulation, was gradually realigning itself under her invisible tutelage. Soraya's frustration reached a climax when a gathering meant to reaffirm her authority instead became a platform for the villagers to subtly celebrate Amira's teachings. They arranged themselves in a way that mirrored lessons she had shared in whispers, executed acts of fairness and kindness during disputes, and spoke with a newfound assertiveness that could not be stifled. Each movement and statement, though seemingly ordinary, collectively symbolized the triumph of Amira's influence. The councilwoman, visibly shaken, realized that her schemes had failed entirely, and that the girl she had attempted to silence had succeeded in shaping the village's conscience without ever returning home. The consequences for Soraya were inevitable. Publicly, she found herself humiliated as her manipulations were revealed through the villagers' collective defiance. Elders who had once aligned with her distanced themselves, unwilling to bear the shame of association. Her control over decisions, previously unquestioned, was stripped away by the very community she had sought to dominate. In private, she fled the village under the weight of disgrace, or perhaps faced symbolic consequences that marked the end of her reign of fear. Her influence, once feared and absolute, was reduced to whispers of regret and cautionary tales. Through it all, the villagers never spoke Amira's name openly, honoring the secrecy imposed by the past conspiracy, yet their actions made the girl's presence undeniable. They enacted her teachings, celebrated the principles she had inspired, and created a living testament to her power. Even in exile, Amira was a force that redefined morality, courage, and integrity in the village. She had proven that influence was not dependent on visibility or authority, but on the enduring resonance of wisdom, compassion, and courage. As the dust settled and the village adjusted to its new reality, a sense of renewal settled over the community. Fear no longer dictated obedience, Envy no longer corrupted decisions, and injustice was met with quiet but firm resistance. The moral fabric of Luanga had been reshaped, threaded with the invisible guidance of the girl who had been buried in silence but whose power could not be contained. Amira, standing on a distant cliff as the wind swept through the trees and over the rooftops, allowed herself a quiet smile. She had been silenced physically, erased from records and banned from the village, yet her influence had become tangible, undeniable and lasting. Soraya's downfall was proof not only of the futility of envy and cruelty but also of the extraordinary reach of courage, integrity and moral guidance. The village had learned to speak through deeds inspired by whispers, to honor principles rather than titles, and to embrace change guided by the unseen hand of one remarkable girl. In that moment, Amira understood fully the power of her gift, that a voice, when wielded with wisdom, compassion and courage, could resonate far beyond the constraints of visibility, recognition or imposed silence, transforming the hearts of a community and reshaping the destiny of all it touched. The first light of dawn revealed a village in quiet transformation. Though Amira had been physically absent for so long, and though her name had been forcibly erased from official records, the memory of her deeds and the impact of her guidance had not faded. Villagers, emboldened by the subtle changes her whispers had inspired, began to speak of her openly, not as an act of defiance against fear, but as a celebration of truth, courage and moral integrity. Stories of her bravery, her wisdom and her unwavering kindness passed from one generation to the next, no longer whispered in shadows but recounted with pride and reverence. Mothers told their children of the girl who had shaped the hearts of the village, fathers shared lessons learned from her guidance, and elders quietly nodded in acknowledgement of the extraordinary force she had become, a force that no conspiracy could bury. Amira herself, still physically distant, observed this restoration of memory with a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had never sought recognition or accolades, understanding from the beginning that true power did not lie in titles, public acknowledgement, or the adoration of crowds. Instead, it resided in the subtle yet enduring influence one could have over others, the ability to inspire courage, cultivate compassion, and sow seeds of justice in hearts previously bound by fear. Watching the villagers openly honor her teachings, she felt a profound validation of her philosophy. Her impact had not been erased, and her voice had carried farther than anyone, including herself, might have imagined. The act of restoring her name brought about subtle yet significant changes in the village. Elders who had once enforced silence now shared her lessons openly, recounting tales of her ingenuity, her courage, and her unwavering integrity. They encouraged children to embody the virtues she had modeled, framing these stories as guiding principles for life. The young ones, wide-eyed and eager, listened attentively, internalizing the lessons of bravery, kindness, and wisdom. In public gatherings, villagers spoke her name with reverence, teaching others that true influence is measured not by authority or recognition but by the enduring power of one's actions and guidance. Amira's father, long burdened by the guilt of doubting his daughter and complicit in her symbolic erasure, sought reconciliation. He approached her from afar, carrying a mixture of humility, remorse, and hope. "I failed you," he confessed softly, his voice trembling under the weight of years spent in doubt. "I did not see the truth of your heart, the strength of your spirit. Forgive me." Amira, ever compassionate and wise beyond her years, listened quietly. She did not allow anger or resentment to take hold, understanding that reconciliation required patience and empathy. With a gentle nod, she forgave him, acknowledging both the complexities of human fear and the courage required to admit one's mistakes. In that moment, father and daughter were united not by proximity but by shared understanding, their bond strengthened by the trials they had endured and the lessons they had both learned. The village, recognizing the transformative power of Amira's presence and the injustice of her earlier erasure, began a tradition that would endure for generations. On certain evenings, the elders would gather the children and recount Amira's teachings, encouraging them to practice the virtues she had embodied. They would whisper her lessons, share her strategies for courage, and remind the youth that even in silence, one could wield power through action, wisdom, and moral integrity. These rituals, subtle yet profound, ensured that her influence would persist, guiding generations long after her physical presence had faded. Amira herself continued to live quietly, embodying humility in every interaction. Though celebrated from afar, she avoided ostentation, understanding that true leadership was not in commanding attention but in empowering others. Her focus remained on fostering courage, nurturing wisdom, and ensuring that the legacy of moral integrity she had begun would be perpetuated through lived example rather than public recognition. Even as villagers spoke her name and recounted her deeds, she taught by action and guidance, proving that influence carried far more weight than any title or accolade ever could. The restoration of her name also had a broader effect on the village culture. Where fear had once dominated, respect for courage, justice, and moral clarity began to flourish. Villagers found the strength to challenge wrongdoing openly, to support one another, and to embrace ethical leadership over blind obedience. The lessons of Amira's whispers had become embedded in the social fabric, transforming the village into a community that valued integrity, empathy, and the quiet power of positive influence. Her legacy became a living, breathing force, felt in every act of courage and kindness, reinforcing the idea that no force of suppression could permanently erase the impact of a truly virtuous life. As years passed, the stories of Amira were told not just as cautionary tales of envy and conspiracy but as guides for living. Children grew up learning that a single voice, even one thought silenced, could ripple through communities, inspire courage and reshape destinies. Parents reminded them that deeds carried more weight than titles, and that influence grounded in wisdom and compassion could survive attempts to suppress it. The village, once bound by fear, now thrived under the enduring principles of truth and justice that Amira had instilled, her name no longer a whispered secret but a beacon of hope and moral clarity. And so, though she remained humble and distant, Amira's presence continued to resonate throughout Luanga. Her teachings, her influence, and the restoration of her name became intertwined with the life of the village itself, a testament to the enduring power of courage, wisdom, and integrity. Through her example, the villagers learned that true greatness lies not in recognition but in the invisible, transformative force one leaves behind, echoing through hearts, actions, and generations yet to come. Amira's exile had long since removed her physical presence from the village, yet her influence continued to grow, a force that transcended the limitations of visibility, recognition, or the cruel enforcement of silence. From the quiet corners of the forest, where she had made her temporary home, she observed the subtle yet profound ways her teachings and whispers shaped the lives of the villagers. It became increasingly clear to her that true power was not measured by authority, control, or the ability to command obedience, but by the enduring impact one leaves on hearts, minds, and actions. Even a silenced voice, carried by intention, courage, and wisdom, could ripple through time and space, transforming communities in ways that were invisible yet undeniable. In the weeks and months following the restoration of her name, Amira watched countless examples of the small miracles her influence had inspired. Families who had once quarreled over trivial matters now approached disputes with fairness and patience, guided by the principles she had instilled. A young man, long timid and fearful, found the courage to defend a neighbor wrongly accused of theft, drawing from lessons Amira had whispered through the wind. Children learned to resolve disagreements without resorting to fear or intimidation, their actions subtly echoing the guidance that Amira had shared in exile. Even elders who had long clung to rigid hierarchies began to consider fairness, empathy, and integrity over personal gain or fear of reprisal. These acts, seemingly ordinary on the surface, collectively reshaped the moral fabric of the village, a testament to the invisible power of her guidance. Amira understood deeply that this influence was a form of silent authority, one that did not rely on visibility or public acknowledgement. Whereas Soraya had wielded fear to control and manipulate, Amira's power came from inspiration. Her whispers, her moral lessons, and her courage had sown seeds that grew quietly, often unnoticed, yet with roots that could not be severed. In this way she proved that silence need not equate to weakness, it could instead serve as a conduit for enduring change. By speaking only when necessary and allowing the wind to carry her words, she had empowered the villagers to act independently, cultivating courage and integrity rather than dependence on her direct oversight. The effects of this silent guidance were visible in countless moments of bravery and justice. A feud between two families that had lasted generations dissolved when they recalled Amira's lessons on compassion, forgiveness, and understanding. Young girls, previously restrained by fear and societal expectation, found the courage to speak their minds, inspired by the quiet force that had shaped the village from afar. Disputes over resources and labor were resolved through fairness and negotiation, replacing fear and coercion with integrity and mutual respect. Even small acts, such as offering assistance to a neighbor in secret or defending the vulnerable, became expressions of the enduring principles she had instilled. Each ripple of influence reinforced the lesson that power rooted in compassion and guidance outlasts fear and domination. Throughout this period, Amira was not entirely alone. Kahind, a loyal friend who had long recognized her wisdom and strength, accompanied her in the quiet forest sanctuary. He provided companionship, assistance and unwavering loyalty, demonstrating that bonds forged through shared purpose and mutual respect could withstand time, distance and adversity. Together they observed the village from afar, noting each act of courage, kindness, or justice as a testament to the lessons that had taken root. Ghanian's presence reinforced the idea that influence and support could exist beyond recognition or visibility, that enduring bonds of loyalty and love could amplify the effect of one's guidance even when the source remained unseen. Amira reflected often on the paradoxical nature of her situation. Though silenced physically, her influence had grown stronger than it might have if she had remained within the village. The enforced absence, the symbolic burial of her name, had created conditions where the villagers had to internalize her lessons, carry them in their hearts and act independently, rather than relying on her presence for validation or instruction. This independence of action made her guidance more resilient, proving that true influence is measured not by direct control, but by the capacity to inspire moral courage and ethical behavior that endures even in the face of suppression. The villagers' subtle transformations became a living testament to the enduring power of whispered guidance. Small miracles, such as healed feuds, acts of bravery and restored justice, appeared everywhere, demonstrating that a person's influence does not require recognition to be effective. Through her whispers, Amira had shown that a legacy of courage, wisdom and moral integrity could thrive even when suppressed, proving that enforced commands, fear and silencing were weaker tools than inspiration and subtle guidance. Her power had transcended both the constraints of physical presence and the arbitrary authority of those who sought to control her. As Amira watched the wind rustle through the trees and carry her messages across the village, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had learned that influence could ripple outward, shaping communities and hearts quietly yet profoundly. Each act of courage, each lesson applied, and each small miracle validated the philosophy she had lived by, that silence does not diminish power, that inspiration outlasts coercion, and that true strength is measured by the impact one leaves on the world rather than the attention one receives. In the company of Ghanian, Amira continued to nurture her gift, guiding without asserting, inspiring without demanding, and observing the ripples of change that stretched across time and space. Her power, though subtle and invisible to many, had become undeniable in its effects. The village had learned to act with integrity, courage and empathy, and in doing so had elevated the influence of a single silenced girl into a force that reshaped the destiny of generations. Through whispers carried by the wind, Amira's legacy endured, proving that even in silence, a life lived with wisdom, courage and compassion could speak louder than any decree or command ever could. Years had passed since Amira's exile and the restoration of her name, yet her presence remained alive in the hearts of the villagers. Even as new generations grew up, her influence persisted, not through physical presence but through the subtle, enduring force of her teachings. Children would pause during their chores, listening to the wind rustling through the trees or whistling across the riverbanks, convinced they could hear whispers, soft, fleeting voices carrying tales of courage, wisdom and resilience. Elders would smile knowingly, nodding as they shared these stories, reminding the youth of the girl whose life had transformed their village without ever demanding recognition or reward. The whispering wind became a living conduit for memory and guidance, a bridge connecting past to present, shaping values and decisions quietly yet profoundly. Stories of Amira were recounted with reverence, becoming central to the village's oral tradition. Children learned of her acts of bravery, how she had stood against the oppressive councilwoman Soraya, how she had taught the villagers to act with integrity even when fear dictated silence, and how her guidance had restored justice and moral balance. They heard of her kindness and wisdom, of the way she had inspired empathy, courage and fairness in the hearts of those around her. Even the smallest details of her exile, her whispered lessons, the subtle miracles inspired by her presence, the wind that carried her words, were preserved, each story reinforcing the enduring impact of a life lived with purpose and moral clarity. Elders would often share the proverb that had come to embody Amira's legacy. They buried her name in silence, but every whisper still spoke of her power. It was a lesson in resilience and moral influence, a reminder that the suppression of a person or a voice could never truly erase the effect of courage, integrity, and wisdom. The proverb became a guiding principle for young and old alike, shaping the village's culture and values. It reminded the community that true power lies not in recognition or control but in the lasting impact one has on the hearts and minds of others. Even in silence, influence could thrive, carried through deeds, whispered lessons, and enduring principles. The philosophy that Amira embodied became a cornerstone of education and upbringing in the village. Children were taught to listen carefully to one another, to act with empathy and courage, and to stand up for justice, even when faced with fear or opposition. Parents encouraged discussion, reflection, and quiet acts of bravery, reminding their children of the example set by the girl who had transformed their society without ever demanding acknowledgement. Elders guided youths to internalize her lessons, demonstrating that influence and leadership are often most profound when exercised with subtlety, wisdom, and humility. As the village continued to grow and prosper, Amira's presence remained tangible in small but significant ways. Farmers spoke of how crops seemed to flourish when tended with care and integrity, reflecting the principles she had instilled. Conflicts were resolved more peacefully, inspired by the stories of her fairness and wisdom. Even simple acts of kindness, helping a neighbor, sharing food, or defending someone unjustly accused, were framed as living embodiments of her teachings. Each gesture reinforced the idea that one person's courage, even if unseen or silenced, could ripple outward, shaping the moral fabric of an entire community for generations. Amira herself remained quietly observant from afar, accompanied by Kahind, her loyal friend whose presence symbolized the enduring bonds of love, trust, and shared purpose. Together, they continued to nurture the lessons they had begun long ago, seeing the fruit of their efforts manifest in the flourishing village. Though she had no need for accolades, the knowledge that her guidance endured brought her quiet satisfaction. She understood fully that influence rooted in wisdom, courage, and integrity could transcend both time and physical presence, proving that the heart of a community could be shaped by a life well lived, even when silence attempts to erase it. In moments of reflection, Amira considered the profound nature of her journey. Her exile, the enforced erasure of her name, and the fear and envy that had once threatened to undo her had not diminished her impact. Instead, these challenges had amplified the strength of her guidance, forcing the villagers to internalize her lessons and act independently. Her story had become inseparable from the village's moral evolution, a testament to the extraordinary power of courage, resilience, and the human capacity to inspire change even in the face of suppression. The legacy of her whispers continued to shape not only the behavior but also the values of the village. Young leaders emerged who prioritized fairness and empathy, guided by the principles Amira had silently instilled. Community decisions were increasingly made with consideration for justice and moral integrity, reflecting a cultural shift that owed everything to a girl who had once been buried in silence. Even the wind, carrying her whispered lessons across the village, seemed to affirm that her influence was as vital as the air itself, permeating every home, field, and heart. As generations passed, the story of Amira transcended mere history and became legend. Children would lie awake at night, imagining the girl whose whispers still spoke through the wind, inspiring courage and kindness. Teachers would remind them that the impact of a single life is measured not by the noise it makes but by the lasting echoes it leaves. And when a gentle breeze swept across the village, carrying leaves and whispers alike, the villagers would pause, listening closely, sensing the presence of the girl who had taught them that even the silence could shape destinies. The narrator reflects, speaking directly to those who hear the whispers of history, "Next time a whisper reaches your ear, listen closely. It may carry the voice of a soul who could not be silenced." In these words, the lesson is clear. Courage, integrity, and moral guidance endure beyond the constraints of fear, suppression, and time. A life lived with purpose and virtue has the power to influence generations, to inspire hearts unseen, and to shape communities far beyond the reach of recognition. Amira's story, once hidden and threatened with erasure, had become immortal, a beacon for all who understand that the truest power lies not in titles, commands, or visibility, but in the quiet, enduring influence of a life well lived, whispered through the winds of history, carrying lessons of resilience, justice, and unwavering moral courage across time and space.